The cue ball is really nice, pool cue, because it's a really it's a really sharp. It gives you really clean highlights. It's really sharp. The camera is not the webcam is not great just because it's kind of blurry, but it allows me to do this to point things out on the cue ball in real time. Yeah, the cam with the ball is a little bit blurry. I think it's because I've got it zoomed out so much. So that's the webcam. All right, this is a photograph. The other one is a photograph. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw this first in charcoal, and then I might add another ball to it and do, no, first in pencil, and then I might add another ball and do charcoal. Okay, everybody with me? So first thing you want to do, let's just talk about the, okay, good. Let's just talk about the shadows and the lights of the ball as we can see them. Okay, so we have a white ball. This is a white ball. We have right here is the specular highlight. This here is the masked tone. This here is the core shadow. Down here is reflected light. This is a cast shadow. All right, there's a couple of things that you can notice, especially if you look at the photograph, because it's crisper and closer up. First draw the ball, and now nobody can draw a perfect circle at first go. Just draw it lightly, try to get it symmetrical, and then what you can do is you can measure your ball, because balls are symmetrical. They're the same distance up and down, sideways and backwards, right? So take your pencil and measure your ball and see if you've got it symmetrical. And the other thing you can do is you can turn it upside down. Sometimes, for some reason, depending on whether you're left-handed or right-handed, we tend to lean our drawings one way or the other. So I found that turning it upside down or looking at it in a mirror is a pretty good way to tell if something is symmetrical or not. So that really helps a lot. So now I feel like my ball is pretty symmetrical. You do this from observation. I can't underscore how important it is that you draw from observation, because what you see with your eyes is so much better than what you can see with the photograph. So much so that I'm going to turn up the light on my ball, because it's going to wash out on the video cam, but it's going to make it brighter for me, and I'm drawing it. So the ball is going to be a bit washed out on the webcam, but it's going to be a good light on the ball itself for me. Okay. Now what I do is mark the shadow out next, very lightly. Keep this all really, really light. The shadow, as you can see, elongates as it moves away from the light. The light is about over here. So as the light's coming here, it's going to hit the ball. It's here and it's towards me. Some of you are drawing the ball with the light behind the ball or behind the objects. I want you to have the light in front of the objects in three-quarter height, okay? So bring that close to you. Then the shadow is cast. And I might do some lectures on just how shadows are calculated, so that when you want to make shadows up, you can make them look realistic. So I can always tell when somebody's not drawing from life, because I can tell the shadows are not right. Unless you've been drawing from life and you understand how shadows fall, you can't make them up very well. One of the things that we're doing by drawing from observation and drawing from life and all the gesture drawing and stuff that we do is to train ourselves to draw what we see. And that's really what we want to do, right? We want to be able to draw what we see, so that when we see something in our heads, we can actually draw it, because we understand how it works. You don't understand how it works unless you actually practice. Like, you can't play a piano unless you practice the scales. You can fool around on it, you can make some music, but you can't always necessarily make good music without understanding how the keyboard is set up, right? Okay, so we've got the sphere, I've got my shadow, and you can see the angle of the light. The shadow actually comes down at a angle like this. So here's the ground plane. Here's my little end of my cutting board that I'm using for a table. So I'm going to put that in there. And I'm actually going to even put the black paper that I'm trying to block off the other still life with, because I don't want to move the still life. Usually from the sun, we get what is essentially directional light. All the light is falling parallel lines. When we have a spotlight, the light falls out like this. So in natural light, it's as good as if the sun is so big and we're so small that we get basically straight directional lighting. Whenever we use an artificial light, it's going to splay out like that. So when the light falls on the object, as we have here, light falling on this object, the light then obviously passes the object and leaves a shadow. So then the shadow ends up right here. The shadow is usually longer. It's all a relationship of where the light's hitting the object. But right here is where the ball cuts off the light of the object, and that's where you get the shadow. So right here, just past this point, is where the darkest part of the ball is, because there's no light, almost no light there at all. But then the light comes down here and it starts bouncing around, because that's what light does. It bounces around, and we get reflected light in here. We get a band around the middle of the sphere based on the position of the light, and right behind that band is the darkest part. And right underneath the ball is dark, very dark. And that's what it's actually called, a kicker shadow. It's an additional shadow, but don't worry too much about that. And I want you to really look carefully at the shadow, and if you can see it in the photograph, or set up your own ball so you can see this for yourself. Around the edge of the shadow, it's slightly darker, and it's sharper where it's closer to the ball. And as it moves away from the ball and actually falls off the end of the table there, it becomes, the light falls off, the light comes past here. Here's what I like to think of as the equator of the ball, is the core shadow. Then there's the highlight right here. We're not going to draw the highlight because the highlight has to be white, and we're drawing on white paper with pencil. So we need to leave that, just preserve the whites. Now it may seem to the casual observer that this is a hard line, but it's not. It's very soft. So I always use, this is an 8 start. I use 4B, 6B, and 8B. I don't usually use anything soft, anything harder than a 4B, but you can start with a 2B. In the beginning of the assignment, you should have drawn yourself a scale at the top of the page or the side of the page with at least 9 sections. Most of you have done this. It goes from black to white in a gradient across the page. And you want to use your variety of pencils. You should have at least a 2B, 4B, and a 6B. If you have an 8B, that's good. I also sometimes have 9Bs. This particular pencil is, I love these pencils. They're woodless pencils. They're just solid graphite. The only problem is that they're very fragile and they shatter when you drop them. So if you fill in your first square, and I'm doing this with a 4B, and then your second square with 1 pass, and then maybe we'll even go into the third square a little bit lighter, so it's a little bit lighter. Then I'm going to take a 6B, and I'm going to give this another pass. That makes it pretty dark. And we'll give this a light coating of 6B, and we won't put anything on that second one at all. It's about 8, so I could squeeze one more gradient out of there with a little more time. Okay, so paper, most drawing paper has a tooth to it, which means that it has a little surface, rough surface, and the surface looks, if you went with microscope, you'd see the surface looks kind of like this. When you take your pencil tip and you draw across that rough surface, it kicks off little bits of graphite into these crevices, like so. And if you want to erase it, you can just pull out those little bits of graphite with the eraser by pulling it out like this. And you can actually, if you haven't drawn too hard, you can completely erase whatever line you've made. Like I could erase this line completely, no problem, because I didn't draw too hard. But this line that I drew representing the paper, I drew pretty hard, which means that I've basically pushed down on the surface of the paper and flattened out those little crevices that capture all the pencil graphite. Graphite comes off in flakes, so it layers itself up in a flake on a smooth surface. It's used as a lubricant, graphite. So you notice that, of course, I'm sure you've seen when it's drawn really hard and you've pushed really, really hard, that it starts to get really shiny. And you can actually burnish it to a super high sheen. It'll never get any darker than that, but it will get very, very shiny. So you've put a lot of graphite down on this flat thing and you've rubbed it in hard. Now all the layers of graphite are locked in. They're not going to move. You're never going to get it out the paper. So you want to start off pretty casually, easily as you draw, so that you don't overdo the graphite right off the bat. You don't want to do it too fast. You really don't. You want to really develop your pencil technique so that you can get very gradual layers of pencil graphite. The way that I was trained was that there shouldn't be anything, the darkest shadow should always be on the object. There shouldn't be anything darker, more contrast than the shadow that's on the object. Now that seems, I haven't found that to actually work in actual practice very well, but I understand it because you want to bring attention to the object and not to the things around it, correct? So, keep your pencil light. Now we're going to go work on the shadow a little bit here. The darkest part of the shadow is going to be right where the ball touches the surface. Now, if your shadow goes, if you have your ball and your shadow is going like this from the ball, that is going to be wrong because the ball is actually a curve and it's sitting above the surface of it's only touching the object that it's sitting on in one tiny little place. So this shadow, and like I said, observation. It's got to go from observation, not from what you think, because you don't know. If you only think about it and you're not sure, and you haven't done enough experiments or tested enough theories to make sure that it's true, you don't really know until you do it. So the shadow comes out from under the ball, and it comes round and starts sharp where it's close to the ball. And here's something that's really cool, and you'll only see this if you look for it very carefully in real circumstance, because I think the camera just kind of knocks it out. I can see it in the camera, but it's not as intense as it is in real life. The shadow is the sharpest where it is closest to the light. So this part of the shadow is going to be very sharp, very high contrast, and darker. As the shadow moves away, as the light gets diffused more, the shadow starts to spread out. The center of the shadow is going to have the lightest part because that's the most light bouncing around inside of it. As the shadow extends away from the object, it's going to become more diffuse. So it becomes softer edged. And this is really interesting because back in the early days of computer-generated artwork, you could always tell when something was computer generated because it had very sharp shadows from beginning to end. And then they developed what they call ray tracing. I'm sure you guys have all heard ray tracing. And that's a technology that imitates the fall of light through space, through atmosphere, and diffuses it as it moves further away from the light source. Now in outer space, for instance, there's no atmosphere, or very little atmosphere. It's almost a vacuum. Everything is crystal clear. You see these pictures from space of the planet Earth. It's sharp. Everything's clear and sharp, and the shadows are sharp. There's no atmosphere. There's nothing in between to block the light. The light just travels willy-nilly through it. But in our atmosphere, we have oxygen and nitrogen and carbon dioxide and a lot of other stuff. And that tends to break up the light. So even in a very small space, it's going to break up the light. So here we have the light gets further away, and actually I'm going to put in the edge of the table here too, because I think that makes it interesting. Because the shadow falls off the edge of the table, and you can see it cool thing about shadows, one of the cool things about shadows, that really helps if you understand how shadows fall, and then when you want to make stuff up, you use this technique to create things that look more realistic. As the shadow falls across a surface, it curves with the surface. So you get kind of a contour effect. Here the shadow is diffuse because it's further away from the object, and it's lighter in the middle, but it sort of curves around the edge of the block, which is not exactly, it's not a hard chiseled edge, it's a curved edge. And then we have a shadow here on the edge of the block that is fairly soft, because this is pulling away from the light, and actually there's light being blocked by something else here. But the shadows merge as they get to this point and become one, because now it's in the same, they're in the same place of all the same light. Okay, you notice I'm kind of using the edge of my pencil, the side of my pencil, and that's just to give it a broader layer of, and be able to give it a lighter touch to the graphite. So things get darker as they move towards lighter objects, and things get lighter as they move towards darker objects, so they increase in contrast. And you can see, this is why we talk a lot about using the edge, the value, to define the edge and not a line, because there's no such thing as lines in nature. There are no lines in nature. We're not cut out cookie cutters. We are part of our environment, and the only thing that separates us from the air is our skin. So you can see that the white ball gets just a little bit darker as it moves away from where it's in front of the shadow. It's very subtle, but seeing that and manipulating that, using that for your own devious purposes, is what will make you a better artist. So you can see this gradually gets a little bit lighter. The dark shadow gets a little bit lighter as it goes close to the edge of the dark meaning of the shadow. Now some of that's reflected light, but some of it is just contrast. So it's bumping light back up into it, and it's also making this brighter as it is compared to that dark. This gets a little darker as it goes in front of this, which is lighter. Then it gets really light as it passes in front of this black piece of paper in the background. So this black board in the background, which is a drawing pad, is going to be what defines the light edge of the sphere. Not a line, no lines. You want the background to define the sphere. And no matter what you're looking at, there's going to be a difference between light and dark object. It's going to be a difference in the object and its background. If it blends completely into the background, that means you're not going to see the object at all. So if you see the object at all, there has to be a discernible difference between the background and the foreground, the object and the background. Oh, as things get further away from you, they get lighter, because there's more and more atmosphere between you and the object that you're looking at. Like the mountains, they'll get paler, grayer, sometimes bluer, less contrast, less acuity, less focused as they move far away from you. Like scenery, yes. You want something to move in space in a large scenic background, you will make the things in the background have much less contrast. So this is really light. It's still light as it goes down here because this background is so black. So this still stays darker than the ball and actually becomes even darker. And to me, to my eye, it looks even blacker behind the ball, behind the shadow, until it gets down to this point where a little piece of the light passes between make sure your backgrounds line up, you know, they match up. A little piece of the light shows up, and look at that. I don't know if you can see it, but I can see it. The edge of the ball there, you can see has a little bit of darkness to it. So just where it transitions over the black background to the lit surface of the board, you'll see a little bit more shadow, a little bit darker on the ball side, but then it goes back to the shadow and the ball gets lighter again. I believe you never want to work on objects in isolation, and that goes for anything that you're drawing that's in an environment. You want to work with the environment equally with the object. You have to give negative spaces as much weight or meaning as positive spaces. I don't like being able to see the line of the pencil. I want this to be smooth. Now you can go in and use a smooth stick, a chamois, a tortillon, paper stump, whatever you want to smooth it if you want to, but if you do, I will warn you, if you smooth it in one place, you have to smooth it everywhere. When shadows go around an object, when an object has shadows that then the light's passing by the object, it's skimming the surface of the object, just like, you know, the light coming off here. It's just barely skimming it. So it breaks up a little bit. So yeah, you've got some shadow here, but above this, there's still light, and below this, there's still light. So this is a very soft shadow. Now the shadow on the surface is a hard shadow, because it's a cast shadow. So that difference between this soft shadow here and this hard shadow here is what makes that look like it's an object sitting on a surface. It's that difference between the hard cast shadow and the soft form shadow. And the cast shadows also define the surface underneath. So like I could have this going over another object, and the shadow climbs around the objects and moves on. So it's you can use that as to your advantage to create more realism in your scene. I want to make sure that highlight is the only white part. Everything else is under white, because you can't get whiter than white, right? Only thing you can do is darken everything else around it, which is how you draw fire or anything burning. You have to make everything around it darker. It's the contrast that we're seeing. Our eyes see the contrast in the light. So a gradual fill. So the whole page, or the whole area of your drawing at any rate, and you can crop it in. You don't have to fill up the whole page with graphite. I would crop this down, and once you crop it down, then it gets really nice, because that gives you framing an object, which is sort of like cropping it. It makes it look a lot better once you get it framed. So let's just say we're going to frame this. We're going to cut away the part that is not the put this one up here. Not necessary to the drawing. Now, we don't want a shadow, but let's just say we're cropping it. And you can see it looks much better when it's framed out than if it's just, you know, loose, scribbly mess on the side.